Hi, whoa. Hi, Ali here. Let me just turn down my mic a little bit. I see it's clipping. We're reading part 3 of Mariam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us. The state can't give us transformative justice. Whether Darren Wilson is indicated or not, the entire system is guilty. In these times, November 2014. Everyone I know is on edge. Will a grand jury in St. Louis indict or not? On one hand, how will residents of Ferguson react if, as many expect, the grand jury advises against an indictment of Darren Wilson, the officer who killed Mike Brown? What will the response of the St. Louis and Ferguson police? Photos of the MRAP mine-resistant, ambush-protected police vehicles and boarded-up businesses proliferate on social media. Articles suggesting that St. Louis police have recently stockpiled riot gear and military-grade weapons. It's war, but that's not new. Everyone is holding their breath. On the other hand, what's next if the grand jury does decide that Wilson should stand trial? So much psychic, emotional, and spiritual energy is focused on the successful indictment. I imagine the size of release. I anticipate the countless social media posts crying out justice. I imagine that many exhausted protesters will decide that their work is done. I fear of a return to our seductive slumber and to complacency. I'm not invested in indicting Darren Wilson, though I understand its symbolic import to many people, especially Mike Brown's family and friends. Vincent Warren of the Center of Constitutional Rights speaks for many, I think, when he writes, "Without accountability, there can be no rule of law. If Wilson is not indicted or is under-indicted, the clear message is that it is open season on people of color, that St. Louis has declared that Darren Wilson is not a criminal, but the people who live under the thumbs of Darren Wilsons of the country are." It would say to the cry that Black Lives Matter that no, in fact, they do not. I understand the sentiment that Warren expresses, yet I don't believe that an indictment of Wilson would be evidence that Black lives do in fact matter to anyone other than Black people, nor do I think his indictment would mean that it would no longer be open season on people of color in this country. If we are to take seriously that oppressive policing is not a problem of individual bad apples cops, then it must follow that a singular indictment will have little to no impact on ending police violence. As I type, I can already feel the impatience and frustration of someone who will read these words. It feels blasphemous to suggest that one is disinvested from the outcome of the grand jury deliberations. Don't you care about accountability for harm caused? Some will ask. What about the justice? Others will accuse. My response is always the same. I'm not against indicting killer cops. I just know the indictments won't and can't end oppressive policing, which is rooted in anti-Blackness, social control, and containment. Policing is a derivative of a broader social justice. It's impossible for non-oppressive policing to exist in a fundamentally oppressive and unjust society. The truth is that, as the authors of Struggles for Justice wrote in 1971, without a radical change in our values and a drastic restructuring of our social and economic institutions, we can only achieve modest reforms of the criminal punishment system, including policing. The pattern after police killings is all too familiar. Person X is shot and killed. Person X is usually Black or less frequently brown. Community members sometimes take to the streets and protest, and they're sometimes brutally suppressed. And the press calls for investigations. Advocates call for the reforms suggesting that the current practices and systems are broken and or unjust. There is a racist backlash by people who support the police. A very few people whisper that the essential nature of policing is oppressive and not susceptible to any reforms, thus only abolition is realistic. These people are considered heretics by most. I've spent years participating in one way or another in this cycle. Knowing all of this, what can and should we do to end oppressive policing? We have to take various actions in the short, medium, and long term. We have to act at the individual, community, institutional, and societal levels. For my own part, I start by never calling the cops. I hope more people will join me in that practice. It demands that we feel for the edge of our imaginations to stop relying on the police. It takes practice to do this. As such, we need popular education within our communities about alternatives to policing. I vocally and actively oppose any calls for increased police presence as a response to harm in my community and in my city. At budget time, I pay attention to how much money is allocated to law enforcement. I press my local elected officials to oppose any increases in that amount and to instead advocate for a decrease in the police department's budget. I support campaigns for reparations to police torture and violence victims. I support elected civilian police accountability councils and boards, knowing full well that they're just band-aids. I believe that we need grassroots organizations in every town and city that document and publicize the cases of people who have suffered from the police violence. And these organizations should use all levers of power to seek redress for those victims. Sorry about that. To seek redress for the victims and their families. I list these actions with the understanding that together they aren't enough to end oppressive policing. They will lessen the harm, to be sure, but only building power among the most marginalized in society holds the possibility of radical transformation. And that's an endless quest for justice. That's a struggle rather than a goal. Only movements can build power. We need a movement for transformative justice. To the young people who have taken to the streets across the country and are agitated for some justice in this moment, I hope that you don't invest too deeply in the Ferguson indictment decision. Don't let a non-indictment crush your spirit and steal your hope. Hope is a discipline, and frankly, the actions you have taken and are taking inspire so many daily. On the other hand, a decision to indict Darren Wilson isn't a victory for justice or an end. As I've already said, an indictment won't end police violence or prevent the death of another Mike Brown or Rikia Boyd or Dominic Franklin. We must organize with those most impacted by oppression while also making room for others who want to join the struggle too, as comrades. As Kwame Ture often said, we need each other, we have to have each other for our survival. Take this admonition seriously. We should use the occasion of the indictment announcement to gather and to continue to build power together. This is how we will win. The sentencing of Larry Nassar, who was not transformative justice, and here's why, with Kelly Hayes in the appeal, February 2018. For those of us who believe our justice system must be transformed, moments such as this are one of the tests of conviction. On January 24, 2018, Larry Gerard Nassar, the former national team doctor of the USA Gymnastics, was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison for the sexual assault of minors. The sentence was handed down with biting words from Judge Rosemary Aquilina after a week of an intense and moving presentencing statements from Nassar's victims. Aquilina noted that if the Constitution did not forbid cruel and unusual punishment, she might have sentenced him to be made a victim of sexual violence. She settled for an unsurvivable prison sentence, saying, "To great public applause, I just signed your death warrant." Amid our society's current cultural upheaval around sexual violence, Aquilina struck a chord with many survivors who want and need to believe that justice under the system is possible. By offering the mic to survivors and by aiming violent, vindicative language at a widely loathed defendant, Aquilina has been rewarded with the status of an instant icon. Unsurprisingly, she is also reportedly considered a run for the Michigan Supreme Court. The case launched numerous think pieces, including a misguided, misinformed praise song in The Atlantic titled "The Transformative Justice of Judge Aquilina" by Sophie Gilbert. Gilbert's article highlights how this moment challenges those committed to transforming our carceral system, including people like us who are committed to justice for survivors of sexual assault and who also believe that prisons are the wrong answer to violence and should be abolished. We decry the system and advocate for change that is long overdue. Yet, when the system ensnares people we loathe, we may feel a sense of satisfaction. When we see defendants as symbols of what we most fear and that which we most greatly despise, we are confronted with a true test of our belief that no justice can be done under this system. Yet, like all tests of faith, this moment calls on us to recommit ourselves to true transformative justice. And to do that, we must remind ourselves what transformative justice is and why it looks nothing like the civil death that Aquilina delivered last month. Transformative justice is not a flowery phrase for a court proceeding that delivers an outcome we like. It is a community process developed by anti-violence activists of color in particular who wanted to create response for violence that do what criminal punishment systems fail to do: build support and more safety for the person harmed, figure out how the broader context was set up for this harm to happen, and how that context can be changed so that this harm is less likely to happen again. It is time-consuming and difficult work done by organizations like Generation 5, Creative Interventions, and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. It is not grounded in punitive justice, and it actually requires us to challenge our punitive impulses while prioritizing healing, repair, and accountability. A truly transformative justice would mean that a single survivor coming forward to tell their tale of harm years ago would actually have been believed the first time. We would have immediately focused on addressing the harms perpetuated, centering on the concerns and experiences of the person who was harmed. Next, we would also focus on the person responsible for the harm, but without disregarding their humanity. This means we have to acknowledge the reality that often it is hurt people who hurt other people. Understanding that harm originates from situations dominated by stress, scarcity, and oppression, one way to prevent violence is to make sure that people have support to get the things they need. We must also create a culture that enables people to actually take accountability for violence and harm. The criminal punishment systems promises accountability for violence, but we know that in actuality, it is a form of targeted violence against poor people, people with disabilities, people of color, and doesn't reduce violence in our society. Real accountability calls us to respond to harm that occurs because the person responsible was struggling with mental illness by providing high-quality treatment. If violence emerged because of poverty and desperation, then creating survivable conditions might prevent future harm. If violence originated because of an unexamined misogyny or sexism learned in the family or broader culture, a community process that invites the person responsible to examine that would be more likely to lead to positive outcome than incarceration in a cell where the person is likely to experience more violence. Finally, in a truly transformative model of justice, we would not allow those harms to be shielded by powerful people or institutions. We would insist on focusing not just on individuals, but also the institutions and structures that perpetuate, foster, and maintain interpersonal violence. In Nassar's case, this would include the administrators at Michigan State University and the USA Gymnastics who ignored initial disclosures of sexual assault and took no actions to stop his violent behavior. Judge Aquilina's ruling accomplished none of these aims. But some say, even if the system itself is unjust, it can sometimes deliver justice, and we ought to recognize that justice when it comes. Let us be clear. Our punishment system, which is grounded in genocide, slavery, and which has continued to replicate the functions and themes of these atrocities can never be made just. Prisons are an iteration of structural racism in the United States, which allows some people to be treated as less than human and therefore reasonably subject to all manner of exploitation, torture, and abuse. This is the legacy of anti-blackness in the United States. Even when the system ensnares a non-black person, the prison industrial complex remains a structurally anti-black apparatus firmly rooted in the United States' ongoing reliance on the financial exploitation and social control of black people. This can be seen in persistent disparities at all levels of the criminal legal system, from arrest through imprisonment. Even if we firmly believe Nassar's sentence unjust, we may ask ourselves, should we just sit by as the public applauds Nassar's sentence? Who wants to be considered an apologist for a serial rapist? After all, the reality is that most people who rape will never go on trial, let alone be convicted and sentenced to prison. So we wonder if we should just keep quiet and let the system work, this time by imposing a draconian sentence. But perhaps above all, we may fear the questions we will be asked if we stand up against Nassar's sentence. What will we say when people who are already hostile to transformative justice aggressively demand a solution for addressing Nassar's abhorrent, violent actions? What's your alternative to a death sentence for someone who commits acts as heinous as Nassar's? Some will spit out derivatives. 1 second.